بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
وقولوا للناس حسنا وأقيموا الصلاة وآتوا الزكاة محمد رسول الله إنما يريد الله ليذهب عنكم الرجس أهل البيت ويطهركم تطهيرا هذا بيان للناس وهدى وموعظة للمتقين.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين ثم الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين. Awaited Savior of humanity, Imam al-Mahdi, my respected brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I begin in the name of God, the most kind, the most merciful. All blessings be upon the prophets from Adam to Muhammad, to the Holy Family of Muhammad. I would like to thank the organizers, the ABSOC committee, for inviting me and making this program a reality, and also to some of our additional guests that will be overseeing and getting a chance to see some of the discussions firsthand. Very appreciative that you've taken time out of your Sunday evening to be able to participate in this discussion. God willing, it will be something fruitful and beneficial for us all. So, last month I was in Portsmouth, or the Portsmouth ABSOC, Portsmouth University, to have a discussion on the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and was invited to be, or to come to give this particular talk on Islam and freedom of speech. So, what we're going to do this afternoon is go over the following areas. So I want to introduce the topic and explain what we hope to achieve, how we're going to go about that, and we're going to speak briefly about the history of human rights, the role of freedom of speech within human rights, and to look specifically at the laws of blasphemy in Islam and their practical applicability today, and to understand the challenge of reformation and how essential it is for us to be acquainted with those texts, to understand them thoroughly before thinking that we can apply them, thinking as to whether they are actually relative to the world in which we live in today. The topic has much confusion about it, so we hope to draw certain conclusions on how to deal with the challenge of modernity, understanding texts that are from 1400 years, or maybe even before, and how they are applied in a world today. So, in regards to starting off the discussion, as you heard in the intro, that we're a year on from the tragic events in Paris, Charlie Hebdo, and across the world, and in particular in for example, Scandinavian countries, and sometimes in the United States, there has been an ongoing discussion about drawings, cartoons, picturization of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him and his family. And so this isn't something that is only a discussion for then, but actually if we're going to tackle this issue, it's an ongoing issue, it's not something that's going away. And so we want to talk about the issue of Islam and freedom of speech, because it's something that's very close to our hearts, something that's actually happening in the world today, and if we take a step back, it actually draws a wider picture of some of the challenges that we're facing today. At a micro level, we can look at Islam and freedom of speech, But when we step back, we actually see it as part of a greater discussion that's actually taking place. Because of the recent events in Charlie Hebdo, it's important for us as a community to know how we stand when we stand on such issues. I use the word tragic events that took place in Charlie Hebdo already to underscore the tone of the discussion, because it was something that was a tragic event and something that goes against all humanitarian principles and religion itself. We want to talk, or in this point, we want to understand the concept of freedom and speech, or the words that we're using. The title of the discussion that I was given is Islam and Freedom of Speech. The problem with that term is that it suggests that there is a separation between Islam and freedom of speech. That freedom of speech is something external to Islam. This often happens, and we make this mistake often when we talk in this language. So for example, if I say Islam and politics, someone will think that politics is something external to Islam. Islam considers itself to be what is known in philosophical language as a maximalistic religion, meaning that it's holistic. It covers every aspect of human life. Therefore, Islam proposes a theory or a set of values, principles in every aspect of life, such as an education theory, such as penal code theory, ethics. And it's not just confined to theology and jurisprudence. And so there must be discussions on freedom of speech. But when we use the word Islam and freedom of speech as a title for this discourse, it's not external. We actually have our own framework that we have to resort back to. The last thing is just for us to mention the values and how we're going to measure the success of such an event. As you heard, the university encourages freedom of speech, as does Islam. And so there's no conflict there whatsoever. But because we're going to go through certain texts that are going to highlight traditions that may seem to bring tension, it is important that we look at the issue holistically and that people don't walk away from this thinking something that is not being said. And therefore, when we quote texts, when we quote the Quran and the Ahadith, you will see that there are texts that are calling for revenge upon those who perform the action of blasphemy. We are not encouraging that. It's to demonstrate that these texts exist and how we deal with those texts. So it's necessary that I put that forward from the outset. No one, tries to take those texts and use them in a way which is decoupled from the reality of the theology and from the correct form of jurisprudence. How are we going to measure the success of this event? Well, the reality is that's between you and I as individuals. I can only measure my success in terms of how I felt I had imparted and how I feel that you have responded. But on the other side, for you to take away a deeper understanding of the laws that deal with issues of blasphemy, that would be a great success from my standpoint. But also I need in the conclusion to know how you have practically benefited from these discussions. So that will be something that I'm going to be asking you throughout the discourse this evening. Okay. The first thing we're going to do is just briefly look at history of human rights. I cannot claim to be an expert, but having done a little bit of research, these are some of the points that I would like to present to you. The purpose of starting at this point is for us to build us a picture of the way in which human rights are framed, the way in which they're used today, and for us to see how that is compatible with our thought process. Again, we have to be completely objective and understand that there are flaws in every system, unless it's a divine system being portrayed by a divine figure. In absence of that, we are growing as a human community, and we're continuing to learn from each other. There is mutual learning and cooperation from each other. The first thing is that, according to my limited research, the world's first documented Charter of Human Rights comes from the great-grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him and his family, by the name of Ali ibn al-Hussein al-Sajjad. who died in 713 after Hijrah, or 713 AD, or 95 after Hijrah, which is entitled Risalat al-Huquq, Treaty of Rights. That text is still available until today and widely circulated. It is a multi-point document that seeks to delineate the rights of God, the rights of the human being, the rights of the mother, the rights of the father, the rights of children, and it even goes as far as to discuss the rights of details such as the rights of the body parts. What are the rights of the eyes? What are the rights of the stomach? What are the rights of the feet? What are the rights of those people who seek advice from you? What are the rights of those people whom you seek advice from? It is a holistic document that speaks about human rights. The form of human rights that we are taking today is something that comes from the Enlightenment period. And it's important for us to note the positives that came from the Enlightenment period. For us, if you had a chance to study, or from at least my humble perspective, the Enlightenment period took steps away from religion, particularly the religion of Islam that was being, or a version of Islam that was being presented in the Ottoman Empire and in Christendom. And the reason for that was because the philosophers, and of course the mass, they were looking for certain rights, and they were looking for progress in the way in which human beings were living. They didn't find that in the performance of religion. So for example, basic human rights such as equality amongst people, freedoms amongst people, freedom to move into science, the ability to be able to question religion. These were being challenged and brought about. But because these weren't found in the Ottoman Empire and Christendom at that time, individuals had to break away from the practice of religion to be able to find these things. What a shame that religion that is supposed to espouse these values weren't actually able to implement them. And so, for example, in the Enlightenment period, where people were trying to stop torture, they found torture taking place in religion and found the need to move away from religion. The current form of human rights that we adhere to is the 1948 Universal Declaration, or the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This was framed after the Second World War and was by and large framed by the United States and by Western Europe. Even if you look at the way in which it has evolved, or the way in which other countries, even at that time that they may have intention with, even they have agreed to that document. So for example, the former USSR in 1966, they didn't have too much qualm with the declaration, despite it being framed by what we would consider to be more Western-dominated powers. Some of the critique, or some of the underlying challenges of this particular document on the way in which these were framed. So for example, if you go back to the declaration, of the US Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776, you will note one of the most famous lines in there that says that we find these truths self-evident, that all man is created, all men are created equal. Now, for those of you who may have studied that document or understand the framing of that particular document, the great challenge to that document is that although it may say all men are created equal, the framers themselves didn't actually believe that. So for example, if you look at slavery, slavery hadn't been abolished in that period of time. If all men were equal, were white and black equal at that time? Absolutely not. In fact, when the words say all men are equal, it's actually referring to men in the gender sense. It's not speaking about women. Men and women were not equal at that time. It's all men in the gender sense are equal. So there are certain underlying challenges with that particular document, and as a result, we have improved upon that, or those series of documents from the French Revolution and from the US Declaration of Independence in 1948. However, the critiques that come to the 1948 document are that when it speaks about humans being equal and freedoms, often such a document is used as a precursor to be able to impose certain freedoms. And today, often we find the discussion on the relationship between armed humanitarian intervention and Western imperialism. And it's something that can often be admitted that the document or the wording of human rights is a precursor to be able to create invasions. Interestingly enough, not all communities accept the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights. In the title, it's called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but not everybody accepts it. So, for example, in the 1990s, the leaders of Malaysia and Indonesia made specific objections to the document. And in fact, many of the Muslim countries in 1990 gathered together in a conference to promote or produce their own version of an Islamic document of human rights. This is important because this brings into question the actual term universal. If not everybody agrees to the document, why call it a universal document of human rights when dozens of countries and hundreds of millions of people around the world do not agree to the certain values that are placed therein? This is a very important point, because when we frame the discussion and what is ultimately entitled a clash of civilizations, the fundamental issue is in the way in which people perceive the role of human rights and the values that are instituted therein. So, what we can say is that from the 1948 document is that there is an admittance of common core values. However, it would be wrong to say that it's a universal document, because if it's universal, then it should be universally accepted. Once we've looked at human rights in that generality, and some of the discussions around human rights, then we have to go specifically into the issue of freedom of speech in human rights. So here is a definition of freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is the concept of the inherent human right to voice one's opinion publicly without fear of censorship or punishment. Speech is not limited to public speaking, and it's generally taken to include other forms of expression. Hence, in the context of the discussion today, when we talk about things like cartoons, this is another form of speech. In fact, in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also says that expression doesn't have to be curtailed or limited to just speech. For example, in chapter 55, Surah Rahman, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Allamahul bayan." Allah, God, is the one who taught mankind the modes of expression. So that can be through art, or today digital design, that could be through drawing, that can be through speech, it could be through sign language. So this is a very useful definition, and absolutely, of course, we would know that speech is not limited, or the freedom of speech is not limited to just spoken language, but any form of expression. In Article 19 of the Declaration of Human Rights, it addresses the issue of freedom of speech specifically. And the quote is, everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference, and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media, and regardless of frontiers. So, because this is a value which is enshrined in what is perceived or what is promoted as a universal declaration of human rights, it suggests that that definition should be accepted by everybody. That there's no limitations that are mentioned in there. That is the actual framing of the way in which freedom of speech should be said. Immediately, there is a contradiction. Because if it's a universal document, everybody would accept it. Whereas, if not everybody accepts it, but you're declaring it universal, it's being an imposition upon you. Therefore, it's limiting freedom. How can you have a document that claims universality and freedom to be able to speak out, but then, in itself, it is not really universal? There's a contradiction inherent in that. However, I want to go a step further and ask for some feedback from you and to engage you in the discussion and to see how we deal with the issue of freedom of speech in human rights. I want to create a few scenarios, and they'll only be very brief, but we'll try to talk through them, God willing. So, what happens in the media, or the way in which the universal right of freedom of speech is portrayed, is that there should be absolute freedom of speech. There should be no limitation to freedom of speech. So, for example, in the context of what we're discussing, the Charlie Hebdo magazine has absolute freedom to be able to draw any cartoon in which it sees fits, irrespective of how that is going to be taken by another community. Forget now about Islam. We have to universalize this issue. And so what we want to do is go through certain discussions about the extent of freedom of speech, the extent of freedom specifically, and then the extent of freedom of speech specifically. So we're going to go through some exercises with you for you to see how you feel about such an issue. So the first issue is the question or the debate concerning the extent of freedom itself. Can we have absolute freedom? Now, what we have here is a difference in methodology. So, for example, if you take, and of course we're not brandishing all philosophy in exactly the same way, or all leftist movement in the same way, but for example, if you have liberalism, one might say that you have absolute freedom to be able to act in the way in which you want to act. Is there freedom, unlimited freedom in the way in which you want to act? And if there isn't, why should there be limitations? Where do you see those limitations being drawn? So for example, if we ask about absolute freedom to be able to do what I want to do, we pose a few questions. Nuclear weapons. We can create them, but should we create them? Is it morally reprehensible? Is it morally positive to create those weapons? Now, immediately, you might say, well, yes, there's a freedom to be able to create nuclear weapons. However, what we do is we have to create some sort of construct of law to be able to deal with how we use them. Another one would say, even though we can create them, we should not be creating them. But in either way, you would have placed limitations on those. Pornography. Can we do it? Well, here comes the interesting question in the way in which Islam now begins to frame these sorts of questions. How do you judge whether the act of pornography is right or wrong? If I say I have freedom, it's my body, if I want to be able to act in a certain way, I can do it, who is there to stop me? And therefore we begin to see the issue of freedom and the individual freedom versus the role of freedom within the greater society. What happens if pornography is exploitative of men and women? What if pornography statistically is a lead towards paedophilia? What if pornography statistically has an impact on women's rights and the way in which women are treated and abused or not abused? Islam here balances the individual freedom with the freedom of society and the role of society and the benefit of society. If there is an individual freedom which will impinge upon the greater good or the greater need of society, then Islam curtails the individual freedom, because society's well-being is by priority more important than the individual's need. What about ecstasy? If I have absolute freedom to act the way I want to act, why can't I produce ecstasy, the tablet, and sell it? Now here comes the issue. Because we would know, and we would objectively admit, that in our own society, there is an imbalance in the way in which we deal with certain issues. So for example, marijuana, for example, may be outlawed, might be banned. Its production and its sale. Whereas when you compare marijuana to cigarettes and tobacco, tobacco is far worse than marijuana. Yet marijuana is something which is illegal to create and to sell, whereas tobacco isn't. Alcohol is far worse. Ask any doctor. Go to the NHS and just walk in on a Friday night and see the difference in an A&E room between what's happening when someone smokes marijuana and when someone drinks. The extent of how it is an impact on society, on social services, on the NHS, yet that thing is permitted. And so here, we have to see that although we have the issue of freedom, we have to really understand what are the limits of freedom and actually how the individual freedom plays into the role of society's well-being. Which one comes first? Then we go into the specific issue of freedom of speech. So, I'm going to now propose certain questions to you, just to see how you see the issue of freedom of speech yourself. Can we have absolute freedom of speech? Can I say what I want? Can I write? Can I draw whatever I want? So for example, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you, and feel free to talk up. Is it okay to mock the Holocaust? So for example, if I wanted to draw, so we're living in a land of freedom of speech, and it's all good to be able to make complete freedom of speech and say what I want to say. Is it okay to be able to mock the Holocaust? Can I draw a picture, God forbid, mocking the Holocaust? Yes or no?
I think it wouldn't be right to, but I would definitely support it. I would support you. I would say, yeah, absolutely, you should be able to do so.
Okay. Why is it okay to mock the Holocaust?
Because you should have the right to freely express your opinions, and you should have the right to, if you do mock the Holocaust, to not be imprisoned or assaulted or banned, but people should engage in a discussion with you or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's free to express your opinions.
So if I wanted to draw a picture of our Jewish brothers and mocking them being gassed, for example,
Yeah.
this would be okay?
I'd say it morally wouldn't be okay
Mhm.
for me,
Mhm.
but you should be allowed to do it because
Mhm.
I think it's immoral to curtail your speech.
Good. Any other opinions?
Is the presumption that we are in a land of absolute freedom?
I don't think
No.
No.
we're
For-
asking
no.
what,
For the question.
Can I have
Yeah.
freedom to do that?
Yeah.
Can I have the freedom, should I have the freedom to be able to mock the Holocaust, for example?
I think if we assume that everybody is absolutely free to do anything in that imaginary land you're referring to, then what we will miss is any stand to hold to say that whether it's wrong or even right. How can I say if that's wrong or that's right? It's absolute freedom. It means that there is no measure. You have no merit. So yeah, that's my answer.
Here's an interesting one. Can I mock Donald Trump?
Actually, I was going to say something about the Holocaust.
Please.
I feel like you're asking two different questions. When you
Yep.
say, is it okay to mock the Holocaust, rather than should people be allowed to
Yeah,
mock the
should you
Holocaust?
ban people mocking the Holocaust?
Yeah, so I think these are two different questions. Like saying to
Yep.
someone, should you arrest them because they cheated on their partner, or it's okay for the person to cheat on their partner? If I say the person is allowed to, it doesn't mean that I'm saying I think it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
There's a difference between punishing them for that. I think it's that person's.
But we're coming on to the issue of punishment. So I agree with you. I agree with the two separate questions.
Yeah.
I suppose I here want to explore about whether we have the freedom to be able to do that. And I think you brought up the right point, which we're trying to explore now. And is that morally right? And if it isn't morally right, why do we act upon something that's immoral?
Okay. I do see a distinction between, like, I'm not for freedom of action, if that makes sense. I don't think everybody should be able to freely do that. That sounds the same. But freedom of speech is something I definitely back. That's
Yeah.
kind of unrelated. I was meant to relate that.
I was saying the same thing, but I was just the same thing. Oh, someone asks you, for example, if you have a friend and you have to lie to them, there's a difference between you lying to them and believing that you lie, saying that you lying to them is okay. If you, you understand what I'm saying?
Yep.
Yes. So it's just, I think this thing is, the morality question doesn't come in when you talk about freedom. It's about if it doesn't infringe on someone else's right, then that person should be allowed to do it. I don't think, for me, the human rights and morality are two different things.
Thank you. Okay, good. So we asked, are you allowed to mock Donald Trump, for example?
Yeah.
Yes? So, if, what's the purpose of mocking Donald Trump? To what end? To what goal?
What goal? To show that he's stupid and that people shouldn't follow him, and you discredit him so people don't follow that stuff.
So we discredit him, and we use the medium of mocking to be able to discredit some of the ideas that he comes out with. So as a Muslim, what we're going to be doing, we're going to be challenged by this issue. So for example, when it comes to the mocking of the Holocaust, so is it okay for someone to mock a holy event or an important historical event in our own history? Is it okay for someone, is it okay for me to mock Donald Trump, but at the same time curtail someone from mocking someone who is of a prophetic nature in my religion? This creates a problem in the mind, because we immediately say, yes, let me mock Donald Trump, but don't mock one of my own holy personalities. Can I promote Nazism? If I've got freedom of speech, can I promote Nazism specifically?
So, well, yeah, you physically can. You know.
No, of course we can. I mean, I can do that here, right? But
yeah,
we're asking you at a conceptual
yeah.
level.
I know it's kind of like an unpopular subject, but again, I kind of
prefer if you didn't. So.
Oh no, I'm not going to. It's not something I'm planning on doing. Don't worry.
Because I mean, in things like Germany, it's actually illegal. But I think you should be allowed to promote Nazism, but I don't think it would be right, if that makes sense. You know?
So why do you have that disparity between what you believe in is a moral precept,
Yeah.
but going against
Okay,
that moral
I guess
precept?
actually try and explain it is, I think things should be banned if they lead to like a lot of harm at the end of the day, and I think there is less harm. So if I allow you to promote Nazism, yeah, I think there's less harm that would be generated if I allow you to promote Nazism and I'm allowed to also criticize your position, than if I try and ban your speech, because I actually think that would produce more harm.
It's unhealthy, isn't it?
Yeah.
What happens if you just ban it?
What happens if I ban it?
Yeah.
Me personally, I think such ideas go underground.
Right.
Yeah. And they become popular that way.
Right.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in, I mean, like, I'm pretty sure, like, the sort of neo-Nazi scene, if you like, in Germany is a lot bigger than, say, here.
And in
despite
Russia.
it being
Yeah,
banned
exactly.
in Germany, you know, the promotion of Nazism, as far as I know.
Yeah.
That's not actually the way to deal with it, is it?
No,
Just banning it altogether isn't the way to deal with it.
I don't think so. Like, I think you don't give a good reason why people shouldn't follow it. You just go, if you follow it, I'm going to hurt you. I think people are just going to, people are rebellious. You know? Why go?
In a system of law that was created and instituted, say, in the 7th century, is it easier just to ban something? Is it easier just to say, sorry, we can't talk about it?
Yeah, in the 7th century, yeah, of course it would be.
So the disparity here is that the way in which a society was dealt with inherently in the 7th century is very different to the one now. Does a religion need to take that into consideration?
Yeah.
Why?
Because if a religion's stating itself to be universal for all generations, if a religion comes down and it only is for that generation it came down for, say, the 7th century, then that religion belongs to the nation.
How then do you deal with texts, for example, when we say the Quran is immutable? When we say, for example, today, the Quran says, today we have perfected your religion for you. We completed it. So what was being practiced in the 7th century is the ideal form of practice. how do you reconcile the view that you gave with a text that suggests at a prima facie level something other than that?
I believe that the text gives us the pillars for what like a universal society stands on. It's more the interpretation for the current situation, that how to analyse it, how to interpret it. That comes from analysis of the other resources as well.
So the purpose of this was just to open up that dialogue, and I think we're probably on very similar planes here. That the first thing is we do actually have to curtail freedom, ultimate freedoms, or absolute freedoms. But when it comes to the extent of freedom of speech, we can say that I might find it immoral to say something, but the question is, should I actually ban that kind of discussion altogether? What we have is, just as a practical example, do we actually have absolute freedom of speech? And you mentioned actually in some places, talking about certain things is...
even in the West, even in Europe, there's
some things you cannot actually say.
Yeah.
So for example, Holocaust denial. Just the denial of the Holocaust, which absolutely happened. I imagine somewhere between 4 and 8 million people were brutally murdered.
6 million Jews and about like 17 million, everybody else included, all other minorities.
Thank you. But there are 14 countries that criminalize Holocaust denial. So if we have freedom of speech, or here we are being told that we actually have freedom of speech, the question is, well, why is that freedom to deny something curtailed? So it's interesting that you say it's immoral to be able to promote Nazism, but actually I can do it. Is it immoral to deny a historical event, even if it's grounded in fact?
Is it immoral to?
Yeah.
I'd say things are only immoral, in my personal opinion, if they result in harm. So you could be misinformed. I don't think that would be immoral. If your misinformation leads to like people dying, then yeah, it's probably bad.
So despite that, it not being an immoral thing, yet it's still bad.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, I think people assume it's immoral because if you deny the Holocaust, a lot of neo-Nazis deny the Holocaust, and I think it's a Jewish conspiracy. So maybe people are like, well, that's anti-Semitic.
But why ban that speech? What's the harm? What's the outcome in it?
I don't know. Like, I just personally think the people that do that are kind of deluded, and they just imagine there's a negative outcome.
I was just going to say, I think that kind of the idea is that if you don't ban these sort of like dangerous ideas, they'll spread, and then
people
harm will result from that.
yeah.
People will take actions that directly result in harm. But I think that's kind of a ridiculous situation to be in, where you're worried about an idea spreading. If it's a bad idea, you should be able to combat that by discussing it. If you can't beat it by discussing it, then maybe you're going to end up being persuaded yourself that it isn't a bad idea. It just seems kind of...
Thank you. So here, I just wanted to note a couple of noted academics in this particular field, and just mention what they have said about the relationship between ultimate freedom of speech. So Bhikkhu Parekh said that unlimited freedom of speech counted specifically Western and not universal rights. This is interesting because not everyone shares that opinion that we have or should have absolute freedoms of speech or unlimited freedom of speech. April Carter, she states, desire to promote one's own understanding of universal good can lead to cultural insensitivity or even intolerance. Okay, so having just thought about some of those issues, and I imagine everyone has their own opinions, I just want to move on to certain the issue of blasphemy laws in Islam, and just to see some of the texts that are mentioned and how they're enacted upon, and for us to be able to understand them today. This is really the crux of the discussion, because I think in some ways that these texts might be new to certain people, or that it will just shed light on why that there is a disparity in the way in which Islam acts upon the issue of blasphemy. So I just wanted to start by mentioning that blasphemy laws are mentioned in the previous religions as well. So for example, and I'm not an expert in Judaism or Christianity, but just briefly reading into the topic, Judaism, for example, in the book of Leviticus says, whoever curseth God, curseth his God, shall bear his sin, and he that blaspheme the name of the Lord, he shall be put to death, and all the congregation shall certainly stone him, as well as the stranger, as he that is born in the land. When he blasphemed the name of the Lord, shall be put to death. So those who are from within the land and those who are external to the land, they should be treated exactly the same. In Christianity, in the book of Matthew, and so I tell you, every kind of sin and slander can be forgiven, but blasphemy against the Spirit will not be forgiven. Now, it can be argued that because of that clash between Judaism and Christianity and modernity, by and large, some of these concepts or these practices, of course, have been swept away with. We don't really practice that. I mean, it actually specifies that blasphemer should be put to death. So, when you come to some of the modern discussions on Islam and reform, for example, Sam Harris, for example, Majid Nawaz, there is a huge discussion on the need to bring Islam into a secular world, that we should separate church and state. Now, from my perspective, the reason for that is because there is a great fear of loyalty. So when you have the concept of God in these texts, the question is, to whom are you loyal to by priority? If the state wants you to do A, B, and C, but your religion or your religious values or your jurisprudence tells you you can't, or you have to do something the other, there's a conflict, and so secularized state wishes for you to remove your religion from all public spheres, anything to do with government. You can practice your worship on a Sunday, you can practice it in your house, you can practice it in your mosque, but outside of that, we want to remove it from the discussion altogether. Islam, by the admittance of those individuals that want to have that discussion, for example, Sam Harris, for example, Majid Nawaz, they will argue that Islam hasn't had that crash with modernity. It hasn't had that crash with science. It hasn't had that crash with those discussions. And so, whilst, for example, here, by and large, it might be that most people have accepted that putting someone to death for blaspheming in these two religions should not be practiced, as we know, many people in Islam still hold to that particular value. And say that yes, even though we have secular ideology or a secular country, that God's law is by our priority supreme over international law, over localized law. And this is where the tension comes in. So, going specifically to the blasphemy laws in Islam, the Quran forbids blasphemy. If you notice there, that's not a statement. I put a question mark there. Because there is no verse in the Quran that specifically says blasphemers should be punished, blasphemers should be killed. There is no verse in the Quran that says that. Which is very interesting, because the Quran actually sets by priority the standard of thought, that the narrations, what we call the hadith or the ahadith, they work within the framework of the Quran, not the other way round. The Quran sets the standard of thinking. The prophetic practice, known as the sunnah, should always be in conformity to the principles of the Quran and not the other way round. The Quran is immutable. The hadith is not immutable. The Quran, by the Muslim standard, is a perfect book, whereas the hadith has been collected anywhere between 50 and 250 years after the Prophet, depending on the various books that you refer back to, and because it goes through a process of chain of narration, it is open to all sorts of errors, and therefore actually the priority is the Quran itself. So just to mention certain verses that speak about the issue, but not directly about the issue, or by word, or by naming the issue of blasphemy. Do not insult those who invoke other than God, lest they insult Allah, the Muslim God, in enmity without knowledge. Indeed, the penalty for those who wage war against God and His Messenger and strive upon the earth to cause corruption is none but they be killed or crucified. Now, if you notice here, it doesn't actually say specifically blasphemy. it says the penalty for those who wage war against Prophet and against God and His Messenger, they should be killed and their hands cut off. Now, of course, we would immediately pose certain questions about when such a verse is revealed, the circumstance of a verse, whether it is universal or particular. But we don't have time to go into that. And another verse that I wanted to mention, indeed, those who abuse God and His Messenger, God has cursed them in this world and the hereafter and prepared for them a humiliating punishment. Now, if that's the case, it actually says God has cursed them in this world. It doesn't place responsibility upon the Muslim to enact a revenge for the act of blasphemy or those who abuse God and His Messenger. Another point that's very interesting is that actually there are many verses where the Quran forbids directly the act of mockery. So again, if we talk about Charlie Hebdo or the general issue of some of the cartoons and things like that, you will see one verse, for example, forbids mockery. O you who have believed, let not a people ridicule another, perhaps actually they may be better than you. So if I want to mock you, in the eyes of God, you may be better than me. So the Quran actually goes a step further and says that blasphemy and mockery occurred. However, with the various verses, there are a number of ways in which the verses talk about the outcome of that. So for example, chapter 6 verse 10, and already were messengers ridiculed before you, but those who were mocked were enveloped, meaning by punishment, by that which they used to ridicule. Now actually here the inference is that God Himself enveloped in punishment, that it wasn't people who enveloped in punishment, those who mocked the previous messengers. When you hear the verses of God recited, they are denied by them and ridiculed. Do not sit with them. Look at the response from God. Do not sit with those, do not partake with those who mock at God or the Prophet in that context. Do not sit with them until they enter into another conversation. Indeed, otherwise you will be like them. You'll be sharing in that sin. Very interesting verse that the Quran is giving us about how we deal with mocking of God and Prophet. And when He knows anything of our verses, He takes them in ridicule. This is speaking about certain individuals. Those will have a humiliating punishment. Again, the assumption here, or the inference, is that that's in akhirah, in the hereafter, that humiliating punishment shall take place. So the Quran here is setting certain precedents of thought as to how to respond to these certain issues. Dozens of verses state that the Prophet, peace be upon him, was mocked, ridiculed and insulted. Does not call for direct punishment or revenge. Does not call for direct punishment or revenge. There is no verse of the Quran that asks or demands that. Now here, just to elaborate, I want to mention a couple of stories, because it may be worth our while just remembering or reminding ourselves about how the Prophet himself dealt with those people who mocked him and those people who actually insulted him. So I'll give you two stories. For example, a very famous one, which talks about a Jewish lady who, when the Prophet used to walk from his house to the mosque, every day when the Prophet walked underneath or past her window, she would throw litter, garbage, to the extent that the narrations talk about intestines of sheep upon the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him and his family. After several consecutive days of having garbage, intestines thrown at him, one day the lady didn't do this. And actually this lasted for a couple of days where she didn't throw garbage upon the Prophet. The Prophet is narrated to have knocked on the door and gone into the house. The lady said, "Do you now come to seek your revenge upon me when I'm unable, I'm ill?" And the Prophet actually responded by saying, "No, I'm actually here inquiring about you. The fact that you have been acting in such a way for so many days, and then now you've stopped, I was fearful that something had happened to you, so I've come to see how you are." The end of the narration says that actually he cooked and cleaned in that house of that Jewish lady and nursed her back to health. Look at the action of the Prophet and the way in which some of these things are being considered. Another narration. one of the Prophet's own family members, probably his most obstinate opponent, by the name of Abu Jahl. In the Arabic language, Abu Jahl means father of the ignorant, or he is the embodiment of ignorance in that sense. One of the verses in chapter 18, verses 4 to 6 in Surah Al-Kahf narrates this particular incident. So one day, the Prophet, peace be upon him, was gifted a very beautiful thick red cloak. Now, in the Arabian culture, as if ever you've been to that part of the world, you will know in the winter it's particularly cold. So the Prophet was given a red coat, which was supposed to be a very warm coat. He took this coat as a present to his most obstinate opponent, Abu Jahl, as a gift to give to him. He knocks on the door, Abu Jahl opens the door, he gives him this gift and says to him, "It might have been that you and I have got off on the wrong foot. You may not have heard or listened to me properly. I wish to give you this gift so that we might find some sort of mutual discussion points." The narration says, and I'm paraphrasing, that Abu Jahl slams the door in the face of the Prophet. The Prophet becomes so hurt by that action. The Quran has a verse that was revealed about this that says, you would almost be overcome by grief because of how much you want them to be believed, how much you want them to believe in your message. So, if you see here, there is a very different approach from the Prophet and how he dealt with people personally mocking him and insulting and abusing him to the way in which certain issues are being framed today. Now, the Quran has set the precedent, and those precedents were very important. Previous prophets were mocked. God himself took upon himself to create punishment. If someone is mocking, do not sit with them, do not partake in the mocking, otherwise you will be part of that in the eyes of God, and so on and so forth. However, we do have narrations, we have hadith, narrations from the Prophet and from his successors that talk about the issue of blasphemy and the response to blasphemy. So, for example, and I put the Arabic there, and it's very small, I put the original hadith and some of the where the hadith can be found. But for example, the Prophet is narrated to have said, "Whoever insults any of the prophets, kill him. And he who insults a vicegerent is as if he has insulted a prophet." So that would refer to the appointed imams of leadership after the Prophet, his family members. So, firstly, this particular verse, or this particular hadith, this narration, it appears to be very similar to the previous scriptures. So, for example, if we see here, we mentioned that in the book of Leviticus it says, "Put him to death, he shall be put to death, and all the congregation shall certainly stone him for the act." The Quran, however, has never said that, has never encouraged the act of killing as revenge for blasphemy. What we do have is a narration, or narrations, that actually talk about that particular practice. We also have another hadith here from the sixth Imam, the sixth successor of the Prophet, Imam Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him. When he was asked about someone who insulted the Prophet, replied, "The most inferior person in society must kill him." Meaning, the person who, meaning anyone who has the capacity, even the most unable, should go out to try to kill that person who mocked, who insulted the Prophet. And if not him, then the second most inferior, and so on and so forth. But to the last resort, he must be killed by the Imam, by the actual head of state, or the leader of the community. But the minimal person should go out and do this. Now, as an FYI, I'm not encouraging this, so we're going to make that point clear. We're simply highlighting the types of traditions that are found within the corpus of narrations. Now, here is a very interesting one, and I want to focus on this for a couple of minutes, because as we've already mentioned, that these do not appear consistent with the Quran. These two narrations do not appear consistent with the Quran. And we said, we work within the framework of the Quran first. What we do have here is an interesting event. Those people who are acquainted with Islamic history will know the background circumstances of the life of the first Imam, or the fourth Caliph of the Prophet, the fourth successor of the Prophet. Imam Ali alayhi salam There was an incident that took place. By the time of Imam Ali, Islam had divided into two, more or less, or actually divided into three. You had the camp of Ali, the family of Ali. You had the camp of Muawiyah, and then you had those people who were known as the Khawarij, who had gone outside of those two groups and rejected those groups. Now, the incident is when Ali is now the caliph. As he's inside the mosque, the Khawarij begin to mock at Ali, the caliph. So if you notice the narration, it said anyone who insults a vicegerent is the same as the one who's insulted the Prophet. He's a vicegerent. Now the narration says that they began to mock Ali, and really mock Ali. At the end of it, they captured that particular Khariji, the one that was mocking Ali, and Ali responded by saying, if you want, they said, how should we deal with him? Because we know the narrations that say we should kill him. Ali said, he who was abused, abuse him back. So if I was abused, if he said something bad about me, at worst, abuse him back. Say something similar to him. Or better yet, forgive his sin. In fact, the Arabic here says, إِنَّمَا هُوَ صَبٌّ بِصَبٍّ أَوْ غَفَرَ عَلَى ذَنْبٍ. Forgive the sin. So now, look at the contradiction. You have three narrations. The Prophet has said, kill. The sixth Imam has said, kill. The first Imam has said, forgive. At worst, abuse the person back. Make your point back. Or forgive the particular sin. Now this is important, because they're living in different times. The Prophet, if we accept these narrations, they are living in different times, different eras. The Khawarij were a particularly violent group. The only way I can describe the Khawarij is to align them with the ISIS of today. The Khawarij were like ISIS. So to give you an example of what the Khawarij were like at the time of Ali, 50 odd years after the Prophet. There's one story that is mentioned in the books of history. The Khawarij who had rejected Ali and wanted to kill the followers of Ali, they would go to marketplaces and find the followers of Ali, and they would identify an individual. They would surround him in the marketplace without him realizing, take out their swords and stab those individuals who were the followers of Ali to death. It's this sort of action that is being performed by ISIS today, when they will go into a marketplace and place a bomb in a car and just indiscriminately kill anyone who is in opposition to them, which we're seeing around the world, unfortunately, today. The heritage comes from the opposition of Ali and the Khawarij. His response to a Khariji, who is someone who is now by nature very violent, his response is, don't kill him, at worst, abuse him back. Whatever he said about me, say the same. Or forgive him his sin, better yet. Why? If you have a Khariji of the mentality where he just wants to go out killing people, and you kill him as punishment for blasphemy, how will the rest of his group take that particular event? How will it react within society? The Khawarij, who are already out and aggressive to kill population, they will respond in such a way where they will become even more aggressive towards society. It will give them a reason to be able to act in certain ways. So here we see that the intelligence of the leader of Ali, the leadership of Ali, is saying that if we accept these traditions to be correct, which is a requisite, if we accept these traditions, he is saying, in his own time, I, as the leader of the Muslim community, need to judge the surroundings, judge what kind of community I'm living in, how people will react to my implementation of the blasphemy laws. If my implementation of the blasphemy law is going to create more bloodshed, more problems within the community, his response as the leader was, forgive the sin altogether. Don't worry if he's blasphemed against a vicegerent of God. Forgive the sin, because it will only create more problems within society. Now that's a very pragmatic way of understanding and dealing with a blaspheme law. However, we still have the initial problem that says that these two narrations that tell us that we're supposed to kill someone who blasphemes are actually in contradiction to the Quran themselves, because the Quran does not tell us that we're supposed to react in that particular way. Here we have two major issues that we deal with. First one, that the narrations are in contradiction to the Quran, and if they're accepted, there's a time in society when forgiveness or letting the issue go is better than the act of responding with violence. It's up to the individual to be able to let that sin go, or the leader of the Muslim community to be able to say, we let that sin go. So, here we want to just reconcile some of these particular issues and talk about how we deal with that. As we mentioned, that we seem to have verses that tell us that the act of abuse of God is a sin, that it was punished by God, it's punished in the hereafter, and that you should not be partaking with those people who practice that. Then we have the narrations which tell us to act. Those narrations are actually in accordance with previous scriptures. And then you have the suggestion to be able to forgive altogether. In Islamic law, there's a structure in which Islamic law works within a framework. And I mentioned three here. The first one is called Maqasid al-Sharia, which is translated as the highest goals or the higher goals of the law itself. In Islamic law, the need of the individual is less so than the need of the community. The community comes first. And above the community would come the nation state, and above the nation state would come humanity at large. If one practices a freedom or a law which would impinge upon the goodness of the society or the welfare of the society, then he is prohibited from doing so, because the need of the society and the need of mankind is by priority more important. Number two, there is another version of this called maslaha, which talks about public welfare. And the third one, a principle or a juristic principle, is called the issue of dhar and the avoidance of harm. The Prophet is narrated to have said, La dharar wa la dhirar. No harm, no harming. Islam does not occasion harm. It does not allow for harm to come to an individual. It does not allow for harm to come to a society. And so again, an act has to work within the framework of how the response is going to take place. Here it becomes interesting as to how we harmonize these particular verses and particular traditions. If we accept the traditions are an expansion upon the Quran, then it shows us how the Imams dealt with those particular issues. So for example, the sixth Imam lived in a time when Islam was dominant in its own area. The Prophet lived in a time when Islam was dominant in its own area. Imam Ali lived in a time when true Islam was not dominant over its own area. The Khawarij and the ISIS-like mentality had become dominant over. And so relative to the way in which people's communities were, you might be able to accept that different laws were implemented relative to the station of the community. That would leave us a very interesting way to understand the issue today. We live in a secular world. We don't live in an Islamic state, and I'm not talking about ISIS, I'm talking about a truer Islamic state. And so, when the Caliph of the Muslim Ummah lived in a world where there was a challenge to the way the society's norms were, he did not implement the blasphemy law. When the Prophet lived, and when the sixth Imam lived, and in their own time, they implemented, or they suggested implementing the blasphemy law. Again, if you accept those narrations, which appear to be in slight contradiction to the Quran. So, what we mentioned was that once we harmonize those verses, we just want to mention about the boundaries of freedom of speech in Islam. Islam does, and I can't speak on behalf of all 1.6 billion Muslims because that would be wrong, I'm only speaking from my personal perspective and research. Islam does allow freedom of speech. It doesn't allow absolute freedom of speech. It looks at the morality of the speech at the individual level, and it looks to a cost-benefit perspective for society. If it's going to be something beneficial for society, then it would be proclaimed as positive speech. If it's something that's going to undermine good values in society, it would be something that would be recommended as curtailed. Now that becomes very arbitrary, because who's to decide what's right and who's to decide what's wrong? If there is a caliph, if there is a governor who is oppressive, can I speak out against him? Of course. In fact, it's necessary to be able to speak about that. It's actually considered to be obligatory to be able to speak about that. So here we do need to go into a deeper discussion about how we deal with that, but at a primary level, Islam allows freedom of speech. What it doesn't allow is when it impinges onto bad morality, and if it's going to be detrimental to society at large. Then I brought up the point about Donald Trump, and this is important for Muslims, because we're expected to be consistent. If I can mock Donald Trump, mock, abuse, insult, swear at, then I should be able to allow that very same thing happening to my own prophet. Just because he's a prophet of God doesn't mean that I'm allowed to act in an abhorrent way to somebody else. There have to be consistencies. So I can point out Donald Trump's flaws in his policy, in his personality, in the way in which he treats other human beings, his racism, his sexism, whatever I want to argue. I can argue those points in terms of policy. What I can't do is mock him and his personality. I can't mock him and abuse him, and we can see the differentiation between those two things. So I have to be consistent. This throws into question the way in which you and I deal with some of the satirical material that is coming in place today. Because I have to be consistent. I can't stop and say, we cannot have satirical material upon the Prophet, but then I promote satirical material upon George Bush, or upon Benjamin Netanyahu, or upon Tony Blair, or upon any individual. I have to be consistent in my morality. What I can do is be able to point out flaws in policy, or where I find danger coming from those individuals, their rhetoric, and so on and so forth, but I actually have to be consistent in my own moral values. This would shift the way in which Muslims act, because at the moment, it's almost like eye for an eye. You can mock here, I can mock there, and everybody ends up just mocking each other. So, just some of the conclusions that or I have tried to present from my particular side. The first one is that human rights and freedom of speech in their contemporary context are a Western construct, and they should not be considered truly universal, because not everybody agrees with that. It's presented in the media, it's presented in, sometimes even amongst our own discourse, that these are truly universal rights. But actually there is a lot of discussion about what they really are. The mainstream discourse appeals to absolute freedom of speech. However, in practice, it's inappropriate and unworkable. We highlighted in action there cannot be absolute freedoms, and we have to thus discuss them as to how we see freedoms of speech. The focus on Islam is within a secular framework of criticism, that we should separate church and state, and that Islam needs to bend towards secular values. And lastly, Islam provides a measured, strict, and also clemented responses to blasphemy within a framework of understanding the society it's appealing to. The society that you're living in must be a form of governing the law itself. And if the act of punishment of blasphemy is something that would not be beneficial to society, as is the case by Ali, then actually the punishment of blasphemy cannot work and it should not be implemented. In conclusion, today we live in that type of world. We have moved beyond that. and we actually need to see the way those freedoms and those norms are being practiced today. If someone blasphemes against God, or against the Prophet Muhammad, or against the religion of Islam, in no way, shape or form in the world in which we live in today, should there be the act of revenge, the act of punishment, killing for the event of blasphemy. In light of that, we condemn the events of Charlie Hebdo sincerely and say that that does not represent true Islam and that we stand against those individuals that perform that action. So, I thank you very much for your time. I hope that's been beneficial to you. Thank you very much.
So, hypothetically, I've booked this lecture hall till 7 o'clock. I'd like to open up the audience to questions. If you want to ask any questions to the Sheikh, now is your chance. You have till, I don't want it to go till 7 o'clock, but you have till 7 o'clock to do that. We also have pizza outside, so that might entice more discussion. But, so, any questions? All right, you there?
I just wanted to kind of make just a few quick points. Like,
Please.
I haven't looked.
Sorry.
I haven't looked too much into it, and so take that into context. But my understanding of sort of what is meant by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or when I think of the concept of universal human rights, I tend to think of it as in they could be accepted by anyone rather than they are accepted by all. And that they ought to be. So, like for me, it's not a problem that calling it a Universal Declaration of Human Rights if not everyone accepts it, because it's more to the point that there's nothing stopping people from accepting it. So, like, obviously we're talking about religion today, so if you have a concept of human rights that is grounded in religion, it's going to be hard to convince people outside of that religion that they should agree with that concept of human rights when they're not part of that religion. So for me, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the idea that anyone, regardless of creed or religion or whatever, it should be able to, in theory...
I respect that. I think the way in which it's being used, the framing of it is slightly different. I think in the rhetoric, it's an imposition that actually it's expected that all people are supposed to adopt that because it's claimed as being universal.
Yeah.
It becomes a prerequisite for that discussion and that imposition, the language that's being used.
I guess
but I do respect what you're saying. I do agree with what you're
I guess
saying.
there perhaps needs to be more distinction between those two things.
That would be my only point, yeah.
Do you have any points of your understanding from your study in the history of Islam in mockery were allowed, or anyone did mockery, now Islamic scholars or
That they did mockery?
did mockery?
You know, we do have texts that encourage... I think we need to define what we mean by mockery, but we do have some texts that encourage insult. And the purpose of that was very similar to how we discussed about Mr. Trump. And the purpose was that we need to undermine him or to just demonstrate, discredit him. Specifically, I think that word discredit is very useful. So for example, we do have a text from the Prophet that says, as for those people who are Ahlul Rayb wal Bid'ah, those people who are the people of innovation, أكثروا من سبهم وأكثروا من سبهم, you should increase your insult upon them. And you should actually do buhtan upon them. Buhtan I can only describe as false accusation. Right? So for example, in the chapter of Maryam, Mary, the mother of Jesus, peace be upon them both, the narration says that, or the verse says that when Mary was pregnant, because it was a miraculous birth and had never been touched by man, those who saw her with her enlarged stomach, they began to perform buhtan, falsely accuse her and say, not to speak ill of Lady Mary, but have you been with someone out of wedlock? That was the accusation against her. which was a false accusation. So the Quran actually has verses, for example, chapter 6, verse 108, where we said, do not insult. And then it makes a point about false accusation being wrong, yet we have a hadith to say that you should do that to the people of religious innovation for the purpose of undermining and discrediting them. Is that in contradiction to the Quran? Yes. Unfortunately, the text exists. Did someone make up that text? I would argue yes. Someone attributed that text to the Prophet and said insult, falsely accuse, for the purpose of discrediting those people who are Ahlul Bid'ah, those people who are the people of innovation in religion.
So that's for the conclusion, what I can see from what I heard from you or what I knew before. I think mockery should be banned in Islam.
Yes.
Altogether.
Well, that's why I suggested mockery is banned. Point 3.
Yeah.
Mockery is banned
Is banned
in Islam.
So we're not doing it, so we don't expect anyone doing that towards
Right,
Muslims.
right. But is it punishable?
It's bringing a point again when you're talking about freedom of speech. Charlie Hebdo or the other events up in Denmark, it would bring a point. If I'm raising my thought or understanding about anyone or anybody and I'm trying to make up my point, would I harm anyone in the society? So if I do harm, I should not be allowed to do that.
Correct.
It could be Judaism, it could be Christianity or anyone else.
Correct.
As we saying, Muslim, they're not allowed to do it, which word of the God said, do not do it, we're not allowed to do it. So if they start anyone raising a point, harming any member of the society by expressing their thoughts publicly, so I think should be banned. And they should not be allowed to do it as well.
Yeah, from the strict Islamic perspective, we have that which is kiraha, that which is makruh, that thing which is reprehensible from acting upon. We have that thing which is haram, acting upon, forbidden, prohibited, inculcates a sin, a black spot on the soul, whatever you want to term and define it as. The act of mockery is not makruh, it is haram. It is not permitted, because in the religion of Islam, there is a direct link between morality and law. That if we find something objectively immoral, then that thing is prohibited.
I had another question about the...
Even though it might be seen as a freedom of speech. So, can I lie? Well, I can, but I'm not allowed. Can I mock? No, I can, but I'm not allowed to.
The other point was about the hadith that you said about Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. I personally haven't heard that one before, but yeah, this one. But what indicating in this one, if somebody did wrong or somebody bully you, you have to bully him back. That
Bully?
or
No, not bully, because again, bullying would be considered to be morally reprehensible.
Yeah.
And so you wouldn't be allowed to do that. But in here, if we assume the narration is true, firstly it comes from a very good source from the Shia perspective,
Yeah.
Usul al-Kafi. It's considered to actually be a correct hadith amongst the scholars. So I look at the time, we have to say if these narrations are both correct, then we have to say we reconcile. In Islamic jurisprudence you can throw both of them out, or you can reconcile them, right? The issue of contradiction, ta'aruf. So if we say this is correct, we have to see that Imam Ali was dealing with the context of his time, the greater society. Similarly, Imam Sadiq was dealing with his own time, and we imagine that there was the issue of Banu Umayyah, Banu Abbas, the transition between Banu Umayyah and Banu Abbas, and also at that time, Islam had expanded and was actually teaching a great amount about its theology and its philosophy to Roman, to the Persians, to the Indians, Christians and Jews in the city of Medina, and eventually for 2 years when he migrated to the city of Kufa. But primarily in the city of Medina, which was the city of learning at that time, you can see that if there's blasphemy laws in the previous scriptures, he is highlighting that Islam is consistent with those previous blasphemy laws. And saying that in this time, when Islam is supreme and preeminent upon the external Roman Empire in this area, upon the Persian Empire, upon the Christians and upon the Jews and the Zoroastrians in this place in Medina, in the Muslim world, if you mock the Prophet of God in this place, in Medina, in this time, then you would be killed. So there's no contradiction for me. Actually, it's speaking about time and place. It's speaking about the greater society and the way in which people were in their own periods of time, which is why it's very easy for me to highlight in our time that
That's exactly
blasphemy
the
law is not
point,
appropriate.
just make it difficult for me to understand. So if you got a power, and if you got a right, and you think you are in dominant position, so force it. You can kill, you can punish people if they are against you.
No.
But if
It's
you're not
in
against
a
it-
true Islamic society.
That's why I just maybe contradict with what he says in the Quran about Imam Ali and this stuff. And this just put me on the point. Okay, if I got the power, I use it.
It's not about
If I
power.
don't have a power, it's better to be stay on the side.
It's not about power. In a true Islamic society, so let's say when these verses are mentioned, that would suggest in a society that was living according to that understanding and that time, those laws were workable laws. So in an Islamic society which lives under those precepts and has that formulation of a society, then if that act is committed, that would be the punishment for it. Now whether it's enacted is another issue, but that would be the punishment for it. So at the time of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, when he's living in that period, the afdal form of dealing with blasphemy was in that way. In Imam Ali's time, the afdal form of dealing with blasphemy is in that way. The best form of dealing with that punishment. It's not about power, it's about the way in which the society is and the way in which they are dealing with their own self and their own conception of justice and values. It's not about power.
I'm sorry, can I just make a note on that? I think also we have to consider the fact that these people were infallibles. So it's not about whoever has power and has got an appearance of being an Islamic leader has got the same, correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, you're
Has
right,
got
because
the-
in the text he's saying
has
the
got
most
the same-
inferior person in society takes it upon himself to kill.
Yeah, has got the right to issue a commandment based on these scriptures. Plus, one other note I want to make is that about Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, we know how much he's been aggravated against throughout his life. When he came to power in Mecca, it's a very prominent narration which says Muslims actually wanted to take revenge from all people in Mecca. When Prophet Muhammad was in power, at the beginning, that's a very good opportunity. Now I've got power. Let's show them what it means. Yeah? But he says, the day is the day of forgiveness. So we have to see them all along each other. Imam Sadiq was martyred. Imam Ali was martyred. So this cannot be a brutal punishment the way we perceive it. I think.
I agree. So in regards to the issue of the victory of Makkah, as you know, when he comes into Makkah, he has the people who have been fighting against for 20 odd years, and he says, Antum at-tulaqa, you are free, against the very people that have been fighting against him when he's in power, which is unheard of, an invasion of an entire city and then completely to free those people, especially in a violent era such as that one in the 7th century Arabia. So I agree, it's not rooted in power, it's rooted in justice and the values of that society. So what I'm saying is, in Medina, you have Muslims, Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians. Their own previous books all adhere to the implementation of a certain law. It would be unthinkable that if that law is actually God's law, that Imam Sadiq, when he's teaching, would not be consistent with that. He's saying to a primarily Muslim, Jew, Christian and Zoroastrian crowd of whom he's teaching, these are your laws and this is our law. It's very consistent with each other. They live to the same values. So of course in that time he's going to say that because the entire community already adheres to that practice. They're already practicing it. It's not new to them. So Imam Sadiq is actually very consistent with his own time. Imam Ali is also very consistent with his own time. And the values that they're practicing are very different values. There is no respect for a vicegerent of God. There is no respect for a prophet of God. And so because there is already a system of denigration, killing, mocking in society, what would be the use of actually killing someone? Actually, in that society, it's better to let the issue go. I think it's absolutely perfect. It's a very good system for us to understand.
Any other questions? Do you mind if I ask a question?
Yes.
Could you explain, so in this time, obviously there was a Salman Rushdie affair where a fatwa was given for the satanic verses, and it caused a lot of negative publicity of Islam. Some will say it actually damaged our reputation. How would you explain, how does that fit in? Yes, with all the imams there were.
The Sharia disallows harm to come to Islam.
Yep.
La darar wa la dirar. No harm, no harming.
Yep.
Islam does not occasion harm. And so if the fatwa went against the higher aspirations of the religion, if the fatwa goes against public welfare, common good, goes against or tries to, doesn't deal with the avoidance of harm, then one can argue that the fatwa itself is questionable. Now, as a Shia, so we're discussing from within an adherent to Imam Khomeini, I understand why he did it, and I think that it had as much to do with the religious law as the political aspiration. That at that time, with the revolution, there was a need to demonstrate authority, and that authority was transnational, was global, and that across the world, the authority of the marja extends to the entirety of the world. Now, I could be wrong on that, but in my humble opinion, what would have been better would have been to invite Salman Rushdie to Qom and to demonstrate to him that the places in which he found his ideas are actually misguided, and that he should have had an intellectual or academic debate with him.
Any other questions? This is your chance. Any questions you have similar to topic, anyone? Or, okay, you first, and then I'll.
What?
Oh, so you look like you had
No,
lots of those
I
questions.
just.
Well, I just want to make a quick point, sorry, just going back where earlier so we were talking about the freedoms we have and so on, and where we place limits and stuff. I guess as I understand it, like, normally the limits are where you start infringing on other people's rights and freedoms. So not necessarily talking about like how we weigh up what is moral, because obviously people have different ideas of what is moral and stuff, but just where the rights can overlap and infringe. So there has to be, you can't let someone else have a freedom that impinges on someone else's freedom.
Where does freedom of speech impinge on someone else's freedom?
No, I'm not saying it does.
Oh, just generally the concept of rights. Yeah,
rights.
absolutely. If I have a right but it impinges on yours,
Yeah.
then do I really get a chance to express that right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Agreed.
Someone's rights has to be limited.
Agreed.
One here has to be.
Absolutely agree. That would be the correct conception of that.
So that hadith you mentioned about accusing those who bring innovation. Somewhere I heard about the explanation of it is that this word is translated wrongly. It's the translation which means make them, surprise them by your answers, rather than accusing them. Have you come across that interpretation?
I think, well, that's the problem. So what we're doing is we're making an interpretation, but actually the language doesn't suggest as such. وَأَكْثِرُ مِنْ سَبِّهِمْ أَكْثِرُ كَثِير كَثَرَ increase in sabbihim, your insult upon them.
No. The other one had the word buhtan.
Yes, and do buhtan upon them. Buhtan is generally translated as false accusation. Like, if you want to translate it as surprise them, is it consistent with the theme of the text of the hadith itself?
It's
The
not.
hadith is very...
It is or it's not, sir.
Sorry?
It is or it isn't.
I myself, if you look within the Quran, the word buhtan means false accusation.
Okay.
So if we want to use a secondary meaning to it, we can do, but as a primary meaning as to how people would have understood that in light of the Quran, buhtan is used as false accusation.
Yeah. The reason I'm asking...
If you accept it, my point is, if you accept it as surprise them, does that fit within the context of the rest of the hadith? When you see people of Ahlul Bid'ah, surprise them with your speech. Does it match? It seems, or my argument would be that it doesn't match.
Okay. The reason I'm saying that, this is because we have famous atheists in the time of Imam Sadr alayhi salam, Ibn Abu Ojar, I think. So you see that when he goes to Imam Sadr, they have lengthy debates. And in his first encounters with Imam Sadr, he comes back to his companion, I forgot his name, and actually tells him off that why did you not tell me what a great personality he is? I thought he was just an ordinary Muslim like the others. So to me, it sounds like the dominant narrations and everything we see from Quran, like قُلْ هَاتُوا بُرْهَانَكُمْ إِن كُنتُمْ صَادِقِينَ, please bring your proof if you are honest, or they say let's start from what we have in common. That's also in Quran. When I put all these together, I don't know, I can't believe that there is an unnecessary abuse or aggravation. I understand there is, but I can't, like I said, that's my understanding when I look at everything. If imams can make an atheist or, I don't know, a Christian, being humble in front of them because of their attitude, that's, that doesn't fall.
It's not consistent with the divine personality.
Yeah.
It's not something that an average person would advocate, let alone a prophet of God or a vicegerent of God. So I agree it's inconsistent. Are there any questions on kind of the reconciliation and dealing with the verses of the Quran and the narrations? Is there anyone that's unclear on what we wanted to take away and that those narrations are not to be misused? I just want to emphasize that point again. Good.
Sorry, we don't want last
I think
one.
they all want pizza.
This, can we say that yes, we are all free as Allah has created us, and yes, you are free to take whatever acts you want, but no matter where you're from, what language you speak, what color you are, at the end of the day, there is a scripture to a guidance. You follow it. I think it's also in Quran that you will see the outcome of it here. It's not just something for thereafter. Can we actually firmly say that too? When we go into a conversation with people of other faiths, or
Say what? Sorry.
so we say, okay, yes, you are free to do whatever you want, and you may fall within pluralism or democracy. At the end of the day, this entire world has got a certain creation rules that when you cross them, you will see the outcome of that in this world, let alone thereafter.
Muslims, as believers in metaphysical existence, we would say that the action reverberates here. So it can reverberate at two levels, at the level of the individual and his or her own human growth, or the curtailing of his or her human growth, which would be spirituality, or whatever you want to term it, ethical growth. And then it would also reverberate in society, so that word that you use, that speech, that freedom you use, can actually impact upon society. So that's what's meant by you will see it in dunya, in this world, as well as in akhirah and the hereafter.
Yes. Thank you.
I'd just like to open up for one last question. If anyone has any last question, then we can end it here. Anyone else? No, I'd like to thank the speaker for his enlightening thing. We'll hopefully put the recording up on Facebook, so if you ever want to review it again, then just visit the Facebook page. Thank you very much for coming. This